Well, if everybody's going to be super quiet, we'll go ahead and start. So we have so little to do and so much time to do it in. All right, so good to see everybody again. I appreciate Kevin taking matters into his own hands and moving people around. Just kidding, sir. Okay. All right, so we are going to be in the book of Ruth. If you happen to read it in preparation for tonight, that's great. We won't really get into it for a couple weeks. Just as a reminder, we're going to have no class on Wednesday, Christmas Day, because it's Christmas Day, so it's a singing, I think, is what we said last time. So we're really kind of using, yes, Gene? Too low? It's on. A little better? I don't want to blow anybody out. Sometimes I sit up here and have a headache halfway through. All right, so we're going to take advantage of those first three classes and use those just for introductory and background material. Then we'll take the week off. Then, I think it's New Year's Day actually, we will actually get into the formal text of the book of Ruth that day. So let's go ahead and kind of pick up where we left off last time. For those who weren't here last week, we spent the majority of the class just kind of looking at the cultural milieu in which the book of Judges existed. We looked at the book of Joshua, we looked at the book of Judges, a little bit of the book of Ruth, and I'd say we spent the majority of our time on the book of Judges, particularly the last three chapters, particularly Judges chapter 19. And just that's the world that in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, when it says, in the days when the judges judged, that's the world in which the events of the book of Ruth are taking place. But what I want to kind of ask tonight is that, and we'll kind of open this up, if the events of the book of Ruth occur in the period of the Judges, why is the story of Ruth not part of the book of Judges? Why is it its own little appendage? Any thoughts on that? David?
Some feel like it's written as a defense of David's kinghood.
You're 23 minutes ahead of us. So, any other less insightful thoughts? Rebecca? Okay. What's that? She's not a judge. Okay, so she's not a judge, so she doesn't get to be included in the mix there. Ellen looks like she wants to say something.
It's countercultural to the rest of the stories of the Judges.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Other thoughts? Jared's pondering. Jared's always pondering.
I was thinking what Ellen was thinking, but she said it better.
Yeah. I would have expected Josh to say that, but okay. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it, that the Hebrew word that we used last time is the word tikkun, which is a word that kind of means a restoration or a healing, kind of fixing something that's been screwed up and that's been done wrong. And when we read through the book of Judges, that's clearly the milieu, the environment that's going on. Nothing is as it should be. Nothing is harmonious. Nothing is orderly. There's no shalom in the land of Israel. That in many respects, Judges is filled with miserly people. It's filled with people who are self-absorbed, people who are selfish. It's nothing but, again, chaos and disorder. So much so that the book leads to the climax of the story is a civil war between the people of God. And by contrast, the book of Ruth is a very peaceful book. There's a lot of harmony in the book. There's an abundance of kindness and compassion and unity. So the book of Ruth, in many respects, is a commentary on the reality of the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is a contrast to the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is a corrective to the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is a solution to the problems that have manifested themselves in the book of Judges. Because, of course, the very last verse of the book essentially says everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king. So it leaves hanging that question, if only there was some kind of central authority, if only there was some kind of central power, if only there was some kind of centralized monarchy, all of our problems will be solved. So, you don't have a king, you say? Well, I'll lead you to David and we'll fix all that. We'll see if a king solves all of our problems. And as we continue to go through this story, we learn But that's not the solution to their problems. So what I want to do to kind of jump off with is I want to use Rebecca's question, which was a fantastic question at the end of class last time. She asked, and tell me if I get this wrong, but if I did, it'll screw the whole next 10 minutes up. But you had asked, when during the period of the judges do the events of Ruth take place? Sounds about right. Sherry's shaking her head more confidently than you are. The short answer that I gave was something to the effect of likely early in the period of the judges, but then I kind of threw an ellipsis in there and said, but there are some problems with that come with it. So just to use this as a launching pad to what we really want to get in through the rest of the class, I thought that would be a good place to start tonight. So if you're not there, turn to Ruth chapter 4, turn to the very end of the book, and we'll notice that David, of course, is the last name, and his father is Jesse, and Jesse's father is Obed, and Obed's father is Boaz, and Boaz's father is Salmon. Okay, that's right. Not the fish, the guy. Now, let's hold your finger there and turn over to Matthew chapter 1. And of course, what does Matthew chapter 1 tell us all about? Yeah, the genealogy of Jesus. And when we read, we'll pick up in verse 4 of Matthew 1, Ram, the father of Amminadab, Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of, what's the name? Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by, which Rahab? That Rahab. Rahab the harlot, okay? And when we get to the very last class of our time together this quarter, we'll come back to Matthew chapter 1 at that point. But Salmon, who is the father of Boaz, is the husband of that Rahab. Rahab the harlot, who of course we're introduced to in the early chapters of the book of Joshua, and who is a resident of the city walls of the city of Jericho. So if Rahab is Boaz's mommy, roughly where in the period of the judges do we think the events of Ruth would take place? Yeah, pretty early in it, okay? Yeah, and to Josh as the first judge, Othniel, we have like 40 years of peace that comes with Othniel. So if we just take this at face value, that very well may be a reasonable place to put it. But of course, we're given the indication with the book of Ruth that it's because it's taking in the period of the judges, when by and large things did not go very well. That might, chronologically, it might argue for the reign of Othniel, but thematically, we might think a little later in the text. But what I wanted to kind of show us here, I just thought this would be an interesting jumping off point. I want to talk a little bit about how we might be able to date this and some problems, because I said there's some problems that come with dating him to early in the period of the Judges, the book of Ruth. So let's talk about these for a minute. And this has probably come up a little bit in Kurt's class on the Exodus, I would guess. But how we date the Exodus impacts how we look at the genealogy of David that's presented for us at the tail end of the book of Ruth, and that's kind of repeated for us in 1 Chronicles chapter 4. There's a lot of consistency and parallel there. This would have been a great opportunity to have a whiteboard to actually write this down. So we're going to start talking about it a little bit, and then I have one slide that hopefully will kind of serve as a summary slide for us. But who is Salomon's daddy in the text in Ruth 4 or Matthew 1? Yeah, Nahshon, okay? Now, if you get out a Bible encyclopedia and look up the name Nahshon, you're going to see one guy. There is one guy in the biblical record called Nahshon, so whenever you read his name, you're reading about the same guy. And what's interesting about Nahshon is he was a Judahite, and he was part of the Exodus generation. So he was part of the group of people that left Egypt with the plagues, passed through dry land through the waters of the Yam Suf, and then spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. In fact, in Numbers, we read that Moses uses him as one of the people for a census that's taken of some of the men in the tribe of Judah. So Nahshon's kind of a big deal in Israelite history. But we said that he's part of the Exodus generation, which means he wanders in the wilderness. And because his name is neither Joshua nor Caleb, what happens to him? He dies during the 40 years of wandering. So his son Salmon, by default, one might think, needs to be born during the period of the wilderness wanderings. Okay? Now, let's put a couple things on the screen right here, and don't read ahead. Just leave some of this here for a minute. So Salmon, of course, is going to be the son of Nahshon, will be the husband of Rahab. He's going to be born sometime during the wilderness wanderings. Now, there's two primary dates that are given for the Exodus, an early date and a late date. The early date has the Exodus occurring in 1446, and that's taken from a strict reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 that says 480 years, 480 years before the fourth year of Solomon's reign, which is typically dated to about 966. That's when Israel left Egypt. So simple math and you get to 1446. And if we spend 40 years in the wilderness, then we have an arrival into Canaan somewhere around the year 1406. Now, we don't know when Solomon's born. We just know he's born somewhere in that 40-year period. So let's split the difference, round it off to an even 5-year mark, and say that Salmon is born in about 1425 BC. Now, David becomes king in 1010. We know this because in Assyrian archaeology, there's what's called the Assyrian Limu lists. And these are lists of Assyrian kings that for the first time in ancient Near Eastern history, we can use what's called absolute dating. Prior to the Assyrian Limu list, we use what's called relative dating, which means I know who came before who, but I don't really know where on the timeline they are. The Assyrian Limu list is important because it's dated based on a solar eclipse that can be dated to the precise day. And in both Assyrian archaeological records and Kings and Chronicles, there's a lot of overlap between the Assyrian kings and the kings of Israel and Judah. So you start putting them together, and that's how within, say, a year, scholars know exactly when the kings of Israel and Judah reigned. And so we know that David began his reign in the year 1010. We know that he reigned for 40 years. If we take that number literally, we know that Solomon began his reign in 970. And so how old is David when he begins his reign? Roughly? He's 30. So 1010 plus 30, that means David's got to be born right around 1040 BC. Some simple math there. 1425 minus 1040 leaves 385 years. And we've got to go through 4 generations to get to David, which means Salmon, Boaz, Obed, and Jesse, they're having these guys when they're on average 96.25 years old. Now, we're at a point in Israel's history and human history where we're well beyond guys having kids when they're 600 years old. In fact, even in the book of Genesis, when she's 89 years old, Sarah hears the angels and laughs and says, there's no way I'm going to have this kid. I'm way past childbearing age. And so is it possible that all 4 of these guys, these 4 generations, are having their kid at 96 years and 3 months? Yeah, it's absolutely possible. But let's compare that to the late date for Exodus, which puts it in the 13th century and the year 1270 BC. Same thing, 40 years. Now we have an entry into Canaan at 1230. Split the difference. We'll say Salmon's born around 1250, right in the middle. Now we have a 210-year window to go through 4 generations, meaning we're averaging 52 and a half years old when these guys give birth to the sons that are on this list, which is a little more reasonable, it sounds, because we know Boaz, for example, we don't know how old he is, but based on the text, he's probably in his 50s or 60s when the event with Ruth takes place. And why do we think Jesse is probably a little older when he has David? Because he's got a lot of kids. Depending on which book we want to read, he has either 7 or 8 sons, okay? So, there's no definitive resolution here, but I just think that serves as an interesting launching pad to consider when in the period of the judges Ruth might be taking place. Because just on the surface level, Boaz might make us think that it's earlier in the period of judges. But when we look at some of the dating, if we take literal dates, it gives us a little bit of a timeline conundrum. And I think in some respects, I think it illustrates a problem with rigidly relying on biblical genealogies for hard and fast determinative chronological records, because genealogies in the Bible are stating a message more so than giving us a chronology. And if there's any doubt of that, all we have to do is compare the genealogies in 1 Chronicles with the one in Matthew chapter 1, and it becomes very apparent that either Matthew lied because he left a bunch of names out, or that was acceptable in that time and place because there's a thematic purpose that's more important to the genealogies, and the same thing with some of the numbers. The technical term would be presentism, which the Oxford Dictionary of English defines as, quote, uncritical adherence to present-day attitudes, meaning my way is normative, especially the tendency to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. So we want to let the ancient literature, of which the Bible is part of it, speak to us on its own terms and let it play by its rules, because it's not playing by John Grisham's rules. It's a very different set of literature. And so oftentimes we are seeking to answer questions that the Bible simply isn't asking. And as we discussed last week, we'll wrap up with this little section, we use the parallel of the Pharaoh of Egypt. All you have to do is read Kings and Chronicles to find out that God is very adept at telling us who rulers and leaders of antiquity are and precisely when events happened. He's not incapable of relaying that information. So when God chooses to not relay information he's very capable of relaying, it's probably done so for a reason and for a purpose. And the conclusion that I draw at present, I reserve the right to change my mind like we all do, but at present, is that if the Pharaoh of the Exodus is specified, it could lead one to the conclusion that Yahweh is more powerful than only that Pharaoh. But by leaving it broad, he's more powerful than every Pharaoh, the most powerful leader of the most powerful nation that Israel ever engaged with in that time. And in a similar respect, if we reserve ourselves to this must be during the period of Othniel, well, this wasn't that bad of a period. This was like the best of the period of the judges. And so maybe God only works providentially when it's easy going, but not when times get tough. But by not specifying for us when in the period of the Judges the book of Ruth takes place, it says something about God's providential power to impact his people whenever he wants and however he wants. So when we focus on the when, oftentimes we miss the why, and the why is usually the theological point that's trying to be made. So before we kind of go into the rest of it, any thoughts or comments there? Or points of clarification? I like the long fade on that. All right, so why then, and this gets to David's comment, why are we going to look at this book? What really is the purpose of this book? Well, as we said last time, endings matter. And what does this book end with? A genealogy that leads us to David. So let's talk a little bit about David. So rather than talking about when in the timeline of the judges did the events of Ruth occur, let's talk about when in the timeline of actual history was the book of Ruth written in the first place. Because obviously it was not written during the period of the judges. So a couple things. The mentioning of the existence of David, that provides the earliest time frame that the book could be written. I mean, yeah, we got some future tellers going on in the Bible, but in general, okay, if David is mentioned, the book is probably written after David shows up on the scene. And of course, we said that he begins his reign in 1010, reigns for 40 years. So at the earliest, somewhere in the early decades of the 10th century BC, might be where we would put the book of Ruth, at the earliest extreme there. But when we read chapter 1 and verse 1, and it says, in the days when the judges judged, does that imply something to you? If not, that's okay, but does it? What's that?
Those days are past.
Yeah, those days are past. Grammatically, both in the English and the Hebrew, there's an element of some distance has been placed here. In addition, in chapter 4 and verse 7, somebody read that for us, chapter 4 and verse 7. Let's read it loud with some pizzazz. I won't make you stand up, but.
Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation and
So why does the author have to explain the custom? Yeah, because that's not the custom. It even says, this is what we did in former times. This is what we used to do. It's not what we do now. Okay? So we don't know how much time has passed, but I think it would be unlikely that the book is written in the early years of David's reign. In addition, we can look at language considerations. So in biblical Hebrew, there's what's called standard biblical Hebrew for those taking notes, and that is the Hebrew that existed during the period of the monarchy. Once we get further back than the monarchy, we get into what's called Proto-Hebrew, which is, we're kind of getting off into the weeds with pictograms and stuff. Standard biblical Hebrew is during the monarchy. After the exile, in the 6th century, after the exile, the language evolves, just like we don't talk like Elizabethan English anymore, and I can't even read the King James Bible because I don't know who the subject of the sentence is, because language changes and evolves over time. So the language changes after the exile into what's called late biblical Hebrew. And the book of Ruth exhibits both styles of Hebrew, standard biblical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew. In addition, there's a handful of Aramaisms in the text, which are loan words that come from the Aramaic language. And when was Aramaic the lingua franca of the ancient Near East? During the height of the Persian Empire, also in the 6th century. So based on the fact that we have a little bit of separation, it seems, from the events of the book chronologically, and when we look at the linguistic features, it's probably not unreasonable to draw the conclusion that Ruth is written somewhere either during the exile in the 6th century or maybe what we would call in the post-exilic period, maybe in the early years as we're starting to return to Jerusalem and we're starting to rebuild the temple. And so we might have this author who we don't know who the author is. We're not going to talk about it. Nobody knows. But it's the idea of like somebody's kind of straddling both camps. They've got one camp pre-exile, 1 foot pre-exile, 1 foot post-exile, and they know both of those worlds well. And we shouldn't be surprised to find that people like that exist because we have one in the Bible who has an entire book named after him, a guy named Daniel, who is in the first wave of the Bold and the Beautiful in 605, who is taken off to Babylon, and he essentially spends the entirety of his life, he's still hanging around when Cyrus the Great shows up on the scene. So here we have an actual guy in the Bible who straddles both of these extremes. But anyway, we talked, I'll just pause there. Anybody want to throw something in or say, James, you're nuts? Jay looks confused. Huh?
James?
Yes.
Mix in Ruth, like the different language elements, are they sort of interspersed?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, not like this word. We're not like leapfrogging.
One is one way and then
Yeah.
forward.
But it gives the impression that it's somebody whose mind is straddling both camps and they're comfortable fluidly going back and forth between the two styles of Hebrew.
That's what I was wondering, like if chapter 4 is written as a exposition on a story that was written earlier, I can see how.
Yeah, no, whereas there's a tremendous amount, like one of the theories in scholarship that I don't have a lot of use for, and I'm guessing few people in this room do, but is the idea of the documentary hypothesis, where we have these 4 individual authorship strains behind the Pentateuch primarily. One of the reasons that breaks down is because there's a tremendous uniform structure within each book of the Pentateuch and within the Pentateuch as a whole. It's like, man, this is one magic loogie if we got a whole bunch of people trying to sew this thing together behind the scenes. But, yes, a Seinfeld reference, thank you. But Ruth does the same thing. The structure of Ruth is really tight, really uniform, really unified. So it's really difficult to draw the conclusion there's a plurality of authors behind it.
So is the thought then the book of Ruth, in whatever shape or form, was carried through generations in an oral historical?
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, oral transmission of the text would have been the primary means of the text. But let's use that as our launch pad to the next topic. So we talked last time about what's called the Deuteronomistic history, okay, which is this idea that the former prophets, what we know as Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that these are one cohesive, unified piece of work that's designed to be read in tandem, okay? There's a tremendous sharing of language, and themes and, kind of just too much to ignore. In fact, really all you have to do is sit down and read these books, and it's pretty obvious that the one that comes next is dependent on the one that came before. I mean, can you imagine reading 2 Samuel and then getting to 1 Kings chapter 1 and being like, this doesn't fit? I mean, it's basically the same story, just continued. And some people even throw Deuteronomy into it and say that that's why it's called the Deuteronomistic history, because Deuteronomy is the jumping off point for it. And the reason, the scholarly argument for why the Deuteronomistic history exists in the first place, of which some people include Ruth, some don't, I would include it, is that we have a group of people who've been carried off into exile. And they're looking around and they're asking, what do we do? What do we do to deserve this? I mean, I don't recall, blaspheming the Lord or anything. I mean, I don't understand why I'm here. Why am I here? Why am I in this handbasket? Okay? And so what the Deuteronomistic history in part is designed to do is to say, you don't know why this captivity has happened to you. You don't understand why you are where you are, why what's happened to you has happened. Here, I wrote this down for you. Read it. It'll give you a pretty good idea of why you are where you are. And when we read through the book of Deuteronomy, when we get to the blessings and curses towards the end of the book, one of the curses even says, by the way, you're probably going to be taken off into captivity. Chapter 28, I believe, verse 41. So that's sometimes why Deuteronomy is paired with the former prophets, to create this overarching Deuteronomistic history. But anyway, that would also kind of go with the idea or the concept that the book of Ruth is either in the middle of the exile, towards the end of the exile, or maybe early in the post-exilic period. Okay? Any questions there?
I'm just going to say it also tells a lot about the customs of old Israel at that time, which had, it just gave you a bigger picture about what they were going through and the way their lifestyle was.
I'm sorry, what was the last part? I didn't hear you over somebody's phone dinging. What's that?
The history of it. The lifestyle.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear that. No, I think that's a great observation.
The customs of the times, just like what we read.
Yeah, in chapter 4.
How they used to, so a lot of the customs were brought up in that book in the book of Ruth, this is what they used to do back then.
And maybe to Jay's point, it speaks to the fact of this predominantly oral culture didn't do a very good job of teaching their children. I mean, at the end of the day, they're in captivity for not literally 70 years, but theologically 70 years, because it's 1 year of captivity for every sabbatical year that they failed to keep. So a little simple math means we're going back to the period of Judges, 490 years that Israel has failed to adhere to the sabbatical year laws that God has given them, which in an agricultural culture, to say every 7 years I'm going to not work the land and let it go fallow, that's a tremendous amount of faith that an individual has to put in God. And Israel apparently was essentially never capable of seeing that level of fidelity through. Okay, so let's go on just for the sake of time. So again, I think I've said this 3 times, but we're working towards Brother Duncan's comment here. So included, we might argue, I think you can make a good argument that while there's a variety of reasons that the book is in the Old Testament canon, and why it works its way towards David is because the book is designed to function as an apology or a defense for David being accepted not only as the king of Israel, but David simply being accepted as an Israelite in the first place. And why could we envision a scenario where somebody steeped in Israelite history might have a problem with David being king, let alone letting it allowed into the assembly of Israel in the first place? Rebecca?
2 ancestors are not Israelites.
What are they?
One's Moabite, the other one's Jared from Jericho.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit, okay? Like genetically, he's 1/8 Moabite, if I did my math right, okay? So let's turn over to Numbers chapter 20. And this, y'all might have, if you were in Terry's class, this might have been looked at. But we're going to kind of expand the circle here. So in Numbers chapter 20 and verse 14, remember, Numbers is written essentially at the end of the wilderness wanderings. Israel at this point is hanging out in the plains of Moab. They have their hand outstretched. They're about to touch the doorbell that will let them into the land of Canaan. And we get this story in verse 14 and following. We won't read the whole thing. But Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel. Basically, let us pass through your land. Let us pass through your territory. And Edom's having none of it. Edom says, nope, we will bring our brass knuckles. We will fight you. Go your own way. They have to go far to the east of Edom, which is on the southeastern side of the Dead Sea. Then they've got to stay to the east of Moab. And it's just kind of a problem for them. When we get over to Judges chapter 11, turn there, Judges chapter 11 and verse 17, the judge who is, I don't know, is delivering the right word? I don't know what the right word is there. But the judge who we're reading about in Judges chapter 17 is Jephthah. And Jephthah is going to take this same story in chapter 11, and he's going to expand on it a little bit. Let's back up to verse 15. Thus says Jephthah, Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, but when they came up from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh. Israel then sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, please let us pass through your land, but the king of Edom would not listen. So basically exactly what we read about in Numbers chapter 20. But then Jephthah goes on, and they sent also to the king of Moab, but he would not consent. So Israel remained at Kadesh. And then where we really want to take this to culminate, where we're really going to expand the circle, is the book of Deuteronomy. And we're going to go to chapter 3 of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 3, 23. And in verse 3, there, now we get the Lord's really full-throated explanation of what we originally read about in Numbers. He says, no Ammonite, who's just a little to the north of Moab, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. And of course, that's getting into Terry's class on Sunday nights through the narratives of Balaam. But when we put all this together, I mean, obviously the Lord is pretty agitated and pretty frustrated with the Moabites. So much so, there are other people groups that he says, look, when you get to the 3rd generation, we'll go ahead and look the other way and let you in. But here he says, not even to the 10th generation, which 10 is a biblical number that signifies completeness or exhaustiveness. Not even to the 10th generation is anybody going to get to come into the assembly of Israel from the Moabites, for the simple and obvious reason that you were stingy with your bread and your water. Doesn't seem like a real just parallel, but it shows God's affinity and love for his people. Now let's put our finger there and pause there, because we could see, okay, that's one potential problem with David. This is a guy who, as being the daughter of Ruth, and of course, we are rarely introduced to her in the book of Ruth as Ruth. We are referred to her, crazy guess, biblical number 7 times in the book of Ruth. She's not Ruth, she's Ruth the Moabite. We are not allowed to forget who her stock is, who her ancestry is. So we can see a problem with David being a descendant of a Moabite. Shouldn't even be allowed in the assembly of Israel in the first place, and he certainly shouldn't be allowed to be king. But let's talk about the Moabites a little bit more. Let's turn our minds back to the passage we talked about last time in Genesis 19. You can flip there if you want, but we'll just do a 30,000-foot overview of it. But again, this is the story with Lot and his wife and his daughters and his 2 future sons-in-law. And the angels come, and remember, this follows on the heels of Abraham saying, well, what if there's 50 righteous people? How about 45? How about 40? How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? Why is Abraham so concerned with the people of Sodom? Because he's got family there. Yeah, he's got his nephew there. I mean, this would be like me and Aaron being like, I don't know what y'all are so concerned about Longview for. Like, what's the big deal out there, okay? When in reality, that place holds a special place in our heart. So Abraham's throwing some concern for Lot, and the angels show up, and remember, they want to test out the city. Let's see what these people are like. And Lot is sitting in the city gate, and when we get to the first class on Ruth proper, we're going to come back, and because this story is interacting with the first few verses of Ruth hardcore. But Lot is sitting in the city gate. He's a man of stature. He's a known commodity in the town. And he says, hey, why don't y'all come in and stay with me? And they said, no, we're going to go sleep in the town square. We'll see how that works out. And Lot's like, no, you can't do that. So, of course, he gets them in there. And same thing as last week. And there's a bunch of men from the city who say, hey, throw these two men out here. We want to have our way with them sexually all night long. We want to sodomize them, where Sodom comes from, rape them, molest them, all this kind of stuff. And you can just see Lot like squeaking out of the door, like trying to keep the door shut. No, you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this. I've got 2 virgin daughters. I'm telling you that would be better for you. And then the 2 angels blind the men of the town. And we're told in the text that they're groping around in the dark, not groping for what they were thinking they were going to be groping for a few minutes earlier in the story. But because of this, Sodom is going to be destroyed. And Lot tries to get his 2 sons-in-law to leave town, but they think he's just joking and kidding around. So he ends up leaving with his wife and his 2 daughters. And of course, we know what happens to his wife as she's turned into a pile of sodium chloride. And eventually, Lot is left with his 2 daughters. Now, we normally look at this portion of the section and we say, well, his daughters have just watched, for all intents and purposes, humankind get wiped off the map. And so they must be concerned with repopulating the earth. But an actual close reading of the text doesn't tell us that that's their concern. When we look a little closer at the text in Genesis chapter 19, I mean, these are just daughters who love their dad, and they say, let's lie with our dad that we may preserve offspring from our father. That we can continue our father's line is part of what's going on here. And so they get Daddy Lot drunk, and the first night, the oldest daughter goes in, has sex with Lot, and then the second night, the younger daughter goes in, gets him drunk again, does the same thing, and 9 months later, 2 sons are born. Lot's oldest daughter's son is, in Hebrew, Moav, but we say Moab, which means the father's son, or son of the father. And the younger daughter gives birth to a son that she calls Ben-Ami, and he will become the progenitor of the Ammonites, and Moab, of course, will become the progenitor of the Moabites. So when we think about Genesis 19, it's again, these would be like NC-17 stories if we were seeing a movie about it. I mean, the reality is the Bible's pretty graphic in places, and if it's graphic, we don't need to shy away from it because it's teaching us something in the process. But in Numbers chapter 25, now we really are in the plains of Moab, and there's some scholarly debate as to whether or not Balaam enacts this or not. But remember, we're like a hop, skip, and a jump from actually entering the promised land. And all these Moabite women show up, and they seduce all these Israelite men and have sexual relations with them. And it causes a huge problem, and I believe the number is 24,000. Correct me if I'm wrong, but 24,000 Israelite men are killed by the Lord because of what's happened between these Moabite women from a sexual perspective. So if we were going to be generous with our description of Moabite women in the Bible, we could just say they're kind of, sexually promiscuous individuals. But I think a better term for them is simply to refer to Moabite women as femme fatales, those who tried to achieve hidden purposes by using feminine wiles such as beauty, charm, or sexual allure. I had to look the actual definition of it up. And the Bible's filled with stereotypes. How do we feel about Babylon? Is it used anywhere like in the New Testament to generically refer to things? How do we feel about tax collectors? How do we feel about Samaritans? How do we feel, Logan, you got one for me?
Auburn fans.
Paul says all Cretans are liars. So there were general stereotypes going on in antiquity. And you better believe it, if we know anything about how biblical narrative works, we better believe it that when we think about Moabite women whose a people group whose very existence is born out of an illicit, incestuous sexual relationship with their dad, and then the theme is repeated on the plains of Moab, like when Israel should be at their most holy, they're consecrating themselves, getting ready to enter the land, and they give in to these women, we would be amiss to not keep that in the back of our mind as we read about not just Ruth, but Ruth who happens to not be a man, but a woman. So put them together, we can understand how somebody might have some concerns with David being not only an Israelite, but a king. How can this guy, from this lineage, from this stock, how can this guy be the most illustrious king in the history of Israel, in the history of Judah, a man who's so beloved by God that he's a man after God's own, and more than any other king points to Jesus? How can this guy be included? And the answer, partly in the book of Ruth, is that, I guess I'll phrase it like this: when you're the kind of woman Ruth is, God will make an exception for you. We see a tremendous amount of grace bestowed by God to Ruth and her descendants in this book. And she takes God to be her God. Your land will be my land. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. The most famous passage from the book in chapter 1. And Ruth demonstrates the concept of chesed in Hebrew, but it's this idea of covenant loyalty. We spoke on it, touched on it last week a little. But chesed describes God's covenant loyalty more than anybody else in the Bible. And God's described with that concept in Ruth, but two other people are as well. Boaz is described with it, and Ruth is described with it. And Ruth repeatedly, as we will see, in every chapter of the book, she repeatedly sabotages her own personal interests in acts of loyalty and kindness and devotion and prioritizing other people over herself. Who does that sound like in the Bible? The guy from Nazareth. And she's such an extraordinary woman that she's called an Eshet Chayil in Hebrew. And let's see who remembers from 5 years ago. Ellen knows it, so you don't cheat. There's one other woman in the entire Old Testament called an Eshet Chayil. Who is it? The Proverbs 31 woman. Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 10. Who can find, pick your translation, an extraordinary woman, a woman of honor, valor, worth. You want to know what kind of woman Ruth was? Read Proverbs chapter 31. So here's what we're going to end on. I think that's why the book is named for Ruth. She's not the main character of the book. That would be Naomi. The book's all about Naomi's problems and resolving Naomi's problems. 2/3 of the book is dialogue. Boaz speaks more than anybody else. But the book is named for Ruth because she exemplifies the godly character that she does. And so I'm going to take the last little section that I had, and we're going to begin with that next week. But thank you very much.
We'll continue on. Hopefully everybody had a profitable Bible study. We, over here in Ruth, did about an hour and a half worth of Ruth in about 40 minutes. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. No, thank you, James. We're lucky to have somebody like James that can really delve in and make it applicable, these big words that none of us would ever find without him. So thanks, James. If you're visiting with us, thank you for being here. We do appreciate you coming out, spending your time with us. If you're still in town the rest of the week, we will reassemble at 9:30 on Sunday morning for our worship service, and then again 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon for a very similar layout to what we just went through for Bible study on Sunday afternoon. I just have a few updates, and then we'll just kind of go through the list. And then Tim will be leading the singing for us. Jared has a short talk, and then Trent is closing us out with a closing prayer. Jim Bumpus did have his heart cath procedure today, but there was a blockage, and they were unable to put in the stent. He is currently in the CICU at the Dallas VA, and he will talk to the doctor tomorrow, probably, hopefully come home tomorrow to figure out what next steps are. So, did not go as planned, blockage, couldn't get it in. They'll figure out some more information tomorrow, hopefully come home tomorrow. Be prayerful for Barry Stewart and his family as that continues on. Beth Savory has blood clots in her legs. She's asked for prayers. She's at medication. You saw an email from Betty Shelley. I won't detail it, but look up in your email from Betty Shelley. I think yesterday it was. Her grandson-in-law, John, her niece, her granddaughter, and she even has trouble with her blood pressure. So the Betty Shelley's family is going through some medical trials now. So be prayerful for Betty. On a good note, Nathan Acacia, I think, is this enough, long enough? We've announced enough that Maxwell's here. This might be the last time, but Maxwell's here. We look forward to meeting him when Nathan Acacia decide to bring him around. Andrea and Carter and Ellen and Josh are the pregnant folks. And also in the pregnant world, Mike and Connie Rodriguez, their daughter and son-in-law had a kid, so they're grandparents yet again. Other than that, we're John 16 and 17 this week. That's what I have, and then we'll turn it over to Tim. Anything else before Tim comes on up? Okay, let's have a good rest of the week.
No slides tonight, so if you take your books out, and go ahead and place your markers on number 263. 263 will be the song of invitation after the short talk. That's Is Thy Heart Right with God, number 263. Put your markers there. Once you've found that, turn to number 505. Glorify Thy Name. 505. We'll sing 505, Glorify Thy Name, before our devotional talk tonight. Know me, Father, we love you, we worship and adore you, glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name, glorify thy name.
If you'll open up to Revelation 21, we'll read a section of that here in just a moment. Over the summer, we took a trip to Washington State and Oregon. We were meeting Stacy's family up there, and we were going to see the different sites. And that's a really long way away, so we flew. This was our first time flying with all three of the kids together, so we got there like really early to the airport. Thankfully, we did, because when we got there, the line coming out of the security, through the ropes, and then down all the way across the lobby and wrapped around all the different kiosks where you sign in. And I knew we were in trouble when at the security line itself, it said that was an hour wait. And then we just kept going around the airport. So we, get in our line, and in between trying to keep the kids close by and inching my suitcase up a little step by step, I'm just looking around. And as I'm surveying what's around me, I was struck with this thought that I think this is maybe what heaven is going to be like. And that's not because that there's like a security gate and a line trying to get in. And it wasn't because it felt like an eternity. That what I saw around me was I saw all these different types of people. I mean, I saw people that were coming from different countries, and I could hear lots of different languages being spoken around me, and I could see people wearing different types of clothes, and I saw old people, and I saw young people, and I saw married people, and I saw single people, and I saw kids. And my mind was drawn to this scene in Revelation 21, where when John is seeing the new heavens and the new earth, and this new city of Jerusalem descending down from the heavens. And when he's describing all that he sees, here's what he says, beginning in verse 24 of Revelation 21. He says, "In this city, the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there, its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it." So this scene of in this new Jerusalem, all of the nations bringing their glory and being in this city. And that's a theme that's not just, it's not reserved just for John at the end in Revelation. That's a theme we see throughout the entirety of Scripture, right? If we go back, we could even maybe say something about Adam and Eve in the garden and all of humanity being together there, but the promise made to Abraham that through him all the nations will be blessed. We see with Israel, like we're studying on Wednesday night, non-Israelites from other nations being brought in or being blessed by the people of God, like Ruth or Naaman or others, or the prophecy in Isaiah 2, where Isaiah sees the mountain of God, God's temple on Zion, and all of the nations coming into it. Or we hear in Matthew 28, Jesus telling his disciples to go to every nation. Or we see in Acts 2, Peter gets up on Pentecost to preach to people who are coming from all over the world. Or we see Paul traveling around the Mediterranean because he knows the gospel needs to be presented to everyone. Or in Revelation 21, the nations coming into the New Jerusalem. And there's lots I think we could do with that or points we could draw, but I'll just draw one from it. What that means is that there is a place in the New Jerusalem for you. Regardless of where you were born, God doesn't care. Regardless of the language you speak, God doesn't care. Regardless of the color of your skin, or regardless of if you're married or single or old or young, that because of Jesus, there is a community and this hope that we have that the things that typically divide people are washed away, that those things have been destroyed by Christ, and that there's a place for me and there's a place for you. And tonight, know that it's because of him, because of his desire to be with you, because of Jesus' desire to forgive you of the sins that are separating you from him, that you can enter into his presence. And if you want to talk to somebody about that tonight, we'll be glad to discuss that with you, or if you'd like to come forward, we'd invite you now as we stand and sing.
Have thine affections been nailed to the cross? Is thy heart right with God? Dost thou count all things for Jesus but lost? Is thy heart right with God? Is thy heart right with God? Washed in the crimson flood, cleansed and made holy, humble and lowly, right in the sight of God.
Let's pray. Lord, we come to you now, and we thank you so much for this week that we've had to spend with our friends and family and our coworkers. And I ask that you be with us all as we go throughout the rest of this week and help us to find a time to be a light in this world of darkness, and help us to walk your path and help us to live each day knowing that you are our Savior and our Redeemer. And we thank you so much for this plan of salvation. And I ask that you help us all as we depart from here and keep us safe. And I ask that you be with those that are sick and that aren't able to be here. I ask that you help them to get better so that they can return here with the saints. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.